Let's look at the Darksword Armory medieval two-handed sword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, this sword you have seen a couple of times on my channel before, but I haven't done a dedicated review for it, so this is it. I'm going to try and keep this relatively concise. Now, first up, this sword has actually gone by a couple of different names, but the link below to this sword on the Darksword Armory website. Now, this has been sent to me quite some time ago now, actually, for review as a free sample. Make of that what you may if you think that introduces bias, but I'll just remind you that pretty much most swords and other things on my website, on my YouTube channel that are reviewed are done so as samples in the same way. So they're pretty much on the same footing. First up, I will say that I do really like this sword a lot, okay? Particularly the way it handles, particularly the blade, particularly the grip and pommel, less so the guard. And you'll notice that that is similar with a few of my views on Darksword Armory models that I've looked at in the past. Now, this sword is a big sword. It's a 38.5-inch blade, which I think is about 98 centimeters. So it's got a little bit more length on it than most long swords on the market. It's above the average, shall we say. And the blade is particularly nice. Now, an important thing that I will mention is that these are handmade objects, and there is going to be some variation in the precise things like, you know, weight or distal taper between one model and another. And I have to say that the version on the website looks like it has a very slightly different taper to the blade than my example here. I personally prefer this example here because it's got a little bit more breadth still in the blade up here, but it's a Type 18 blade. So instead of going straight to a point and being a bit more narrow up here, as the example on the website seems to be, it's got a little bit more girth up here, which does inevitably mean you're going to have a little bit more inertia in the blade. It will hit a bit harder, but it's probably a bit less nimble. So your mileage might vary as to what you prefer. From an aesthetic and looks point of view, I prefer this taper. But perhaps in a fencing point of view, I'd prefer the weight a little bit back more towards the hand, a little bit less mass up there. Depends what you're using it for. If you're using it for cutting and cleaving, or if you're using it more for fencing motions, then you might want a little bit more nimbleness in the tip, for example. Now, in terms of the other overall proportions, I had previously said when I did an initial review of this that I thought the crossguard was a bit short. I want to qualify that statement with a simple fact that actually this is perfectly historically accurate. It doesn't need to be longer. I just personally think that this sword, from my point of view, would look a bit nicer with a longer crossguard. That being said, if we look at the Castillon horde of swords, the Fishtail Pommel, the Group B I think they're called, the Group B swords which have fishtail pommels, which are presumed to be Italian made, many of them do have quite short crossguards. They're shorter than the Type A swords which have a wheel pommel. So even in the medieval period, don't think about some sacred proportion. If a blade is this long and a hilt's that long, you don't have to have a crossguard. And I know we've talked about Filippo Vardi's perfect lengths of grip versus crossguard and stuff like this. So there were individuals who believed that you should have a crossguard of a certain length for whatever reasons. But the simple fact is, if we look at the original medieval swords, you can find some with longer crossguards, some with shorter crossguards, some with turned up ends, some with bulbous ends, some with straight ends like this. So there's plenty of variation. So this is perfectly valid and could totally sit within the period between about 1440 and about 1490. So a big segment of the 15th century, from about the middle until very close to the end. And as I say, this is absolutely a style of sword that you could have found at the end of the 100 Years' War in France, or the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, in fact all the way through the Wars of the Roses in England, and stuff like this. So the second half, middle to second half of the 15th century. Now, I'll just talk about the blade a little bit. So first thing to mention about the blade is it has a hollow grind. That is, it has scooped out edge bevels with a midrib, and it also has good distal taper. Now, distal taper isn't found on all replica swords, but the good makers do it well and put good distal taper on, and this example certainly has good distal taper on it. I'm not going to measure this example, but just to tell you, it's about 8 millimeters at the base of the blade, 7 or 8 millimeters at the base of the blade, and goes down to about 3 millimeters down here. So it tapers quite a lot, and you can demonstrate this by flexing the blade, and you'll notice when I flex it, the second half of the blade, which is thinner, flexes and the base of the blade doesn't. This has all sorts of advantages. It means the sword handles more nicely in the hand. It means when you're cutting through a target, the blade up here is thinner and has less resistance of going through. It means in a bind against another person's blade, you've got rigidity down here, which keeps your blade from flexing too much, and all of these kind of things. But the first thing that most people notice is it makes the sword feel a lot nicer in the hand. Just to reiterate, not all swords have this degree of distal taper, but a lot of them do. Okay, a lot of different types of swords do have this type of distal taper. And this one has it, and it feels very nice as a result. Hollow grinding, what's it there for? To reduce mass. Give quite a fine edge as well, incidentally, so good edge geometry for cutting, but primarily to reduce mass while not giving up rigidity, because the spine of the blade, which is where the rigidity comes from, much like an H-beam or I-beam, the rigidity comes from the spine of the blade, so you maintain the thickness, perhaps even increase the thickness at the spine of the blade, but scoop away the material from the cutting bevels here, which leads to a stiff but relatively light blade. How light is this? Well, the sword weighs 1,500 grams, which I believe is 3 pounds 5 ounces or thereabouts, which does correspond to what they say on the website, so this does match the website example. Now, in terms of this blade, I am not going to demonstrate cutting with it, because I have done a lot of cutting with it actually in the last year or so, and you've probably actually seen me cut with it in previous videos, and I can quite easily tell you that this is a good quality hardened spring blade that has not suffered any defects in that time. So rather than just showing one example of cutting some bottles and some wood, I will tell you that over a long period of time this blade has not suffered any defects at all. It has not nicked, it has not warped or bent or anything like that. Nothing's loosened up in the construction, everything's still rock solid. And it has failed to cut through a number of targets, both bottles and wood, with heavy impacts, and nothing has come loose and nothing has broken or bent or anything like that. So it has survived very, very well. But it has one major flaw. It's not very sharp. And I haven't yet sharpened it up. Now, this will plough through water bottles when you get good edge alignment and get lots of speed in the blade, but it is not easy. It is not an easy cutter, and it should be, from the length of the blade and the shape of the blade and the distal taper and everything else, this should be a phenomenal cutter, but it underperforms because it's not very sharp. You can see I'm running my hands up and down it. Now, I'm not exerting a lot of pressure. If I squeeze the blade and pull, it will cut me. So it is sharp-ish, and you can chop wood and you could chop meat with it and this kind of stuff. But for cutting something like water bottles, and even for something like tatami mats, it is not going to cut phenomenally well as it's come from the factory. It needs sharpening up better than it currently has been done. That being said, I really, really like this blade, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this is probably one of the nicest longsword blades that I have ever owned from any manufacturer. And you know that I own some relatively high-end stuff. I also own some fairly low-end stuff as well, but this, in the, shall we say, the middle to high-end price range, that it is probably mid-range actually, price range, this is a very, very nice blade for the money. Now, other good things about this sword. I love the grip. The grip is hexagonal cross section, which is absolutely fantastic for edge alignment. And personally, because of the systems that I practice, I grip down at the bottom. I don't grip up at the middle like some German longsworders might do. I grip down at the bottom. And that fishtail pommel also aids the edge alignment because it's in line with the blade as it should be. And it really assists and steers like a rudder. So it feels very, very nice. It doesn't have any sharp corners, despite the fact it might look not very comfortable. It is actually quite comfortable in the hand, so long as you don't go too far down onto it. So don't try and put your little finger over the end. So long as you butt up the heel of your hand down to the bottom down there, then it actually feels very, very nice in the hand and assists with alignment and movement. The grip, as I say, is gorgeous, very nicely made, seems to be good quality hardwood. It hasn't compressed in use, it hasn't got any vibrations. The leather is very, very nicely done, and it has, hopefully you'll be able to see, it has a very, come on, focus, there we go, has a tidy seam of the leather down here, which is both straight and completely without a lip, so it has been thinned and done well. The risers, that's these ribs, have been done well. The texture, which is done with cord when the leather is gluing and when it's wet, is beautiful. The grip is gorgeous. I love the pommel. Only one slight, smidgen, tiny little criticism is the corners here of the pommel. There we go, just here. Slightly, very slightly protrude beyond the risers, and that could in theory make a hot spot in the hand or fingers in use. However, I have not found it to be so far. It's small enough and it's rounded enough and smooth enough, it's not really a problem. In terms of the peening, this is a full tang, obviously peened. You can see that the peening has been hammered and is real peening, and is, you know, nothing, I haven't needed to tighten anything up. And it's relatively tidily done. It's not the most fantastic peening I've seen in the world, though I have to say, because of the shape of that pommel, it's not the easiest place to peen either. For me, as I've said before, the weakest point of this sword is the crossguard, particularly the shape of these protruding centre sections here. Now, fundamentally, if we look at this, I'm just stabbing the ceiling, doesn't matter. It's a straight guard in this line. There's nothing really to criticise or say about it in that way, but if we look at the guard this way, there are two things we can say about it. Number one is this central section, there we go, this central section comes out to points here, which is not very typical of medieval swords. It's not something we find, I've never seen it on an original, I have to say. And functionally, it has an issue, particularly if you are a fan of thumbing the blade, which if you do German longsword, Lichtenau, or any other German longsword, might be an issue for you because you want to put the thumb on the blade. Now, you can put the thumb on the blade still, as you can see I'm doing it, and actually your thumb arches over that protuberance. But it's not particularly comfortable because you've got a point in the middle of your thumb joint. So I would say that this guard would actually be better just being rounded around there instead of coming out to these pointed protuberances. I think it would look more historical and it would be more functionally better as well. So taken down to the width of the grip. But the grip's lovely. That is literally my only criticism. And I have to say, if that really, really bothered you, it would be a minimal amount of work with even a Dremel actually, but you could use something a bit more hardcore, even just a hand file as well actually, just to round off that point, and then you could repolish it, or you could use wet and dry sandpaper to give the guard a satin polish if you preferred. But you could remove that point pretty damn easily if you wanted to. But I think as a design, it would be better without that. Now, the second thing to say about the guard is the aperture for the blade. We go in here, it is rectangular, but of course the blade is not rectangular. The blade is flattened diamond section. Sorry, it's not quite focusing, there we go. You can see that the slot, it really doesn't want to focus. The slot is rectangular here and it doesn't really fit the blade. Now, it is a tight fit and there's no movement or anything like that, but it is a bit unsightly and it makes it look a bit amateurish, and it would look like a more high-end sword if that aperture for the blade, where it seats into the guard, as it should with a medieval sword, if it was the same shape as the blade. That being said, DARKSWORD Armory use components on different fittings, so they might use that guard on a completely different sword, and so they need it to fit on that other sword. So I can see why they've done that from a production point of view. But honestly, I think in this price range, I think there should be dedicated apertures in guards for dedicated blades. Okay, at this price point, I think it would look a lot tidier and prevent dirt and potentially moisture, rust, that kind of stuff getting in there if it fitted the blade better. I'll just quickly mention the scabbard. So I have said many times that DARKSWORD Armory scabbards are very nice, but the belt fittings are unhistorical for these later period swords. So I have taken the belt off this, and that now becomes a 15th century scabbard, and it fits the blade very well, and it's very robustly made. You can get a little bit of rattle in there, it does move a little bit, but it's tight up at the top, and absolutely now I could wear that with 15th century kit. I'd put a different belt suspension system on this, and it's good to go. So the scabbards are still good for later period, but you just need to take those belts off. Maybe that's when you're looking at the options to purchase, that's something you want to consider. But as a sword, I really like it. It stood up really well. It's a shame it's not sharper, but I will make it so. I love the grip. I'm not a fan of that protuberance on the guard, but that's just about my only major criticism about it. And I just want to reiterate that I have used this for some quite heavy impact cutting and testing, and it has stood up really well without any form of failure. Nothing loose, nothing moving at all. I hope this has been useful, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon for maybe another review, or maybe talking about something completely different. Thanks for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.